Backstory. 4 years ago, when I was about 11, I got told my mom died. Although I'm unsure of her time of death, I know it was either late Saturday night or early Sunday morning. But on the Saturday that day, me and my older sister were visiting my mum, as per usual, then heading back to her house to stay the night. And from the moment I stepped into her house, from getting from the hospital, I felt sick to my stomach. And I felt like that until I knew about my mum's passing. Anyway, later on that night at my sister's, I found it tricky to go to sleep. And when I managed to, I was waking up on and off throughout the night with extreme nausea, to the point where I was trying to force myself to be sick. And I also felt lightheaded and had headaches after managing to get back to sleep, due to me feeling unwell, which I brushed off as a cold coming. I kept having these reoccurring nightmares throughout the night of my mum dying, and she'd go to say something to me, and I'd wake up again. This repeatedly happened throughout the night, and I tried to calm down by reassuring myself I'd go visit her tomorrow. But obviously that never came, as I was greeted to my dad at the door telling me what happened. But it was like I was expecting it, when I wasn't, because the day before she looked fine. But recently now, ever since that happened, I don't know if I'm going insane anymore, as now all hell's breaking loose. I can't stand to be left alone in the house, as some things have gone on that I can't explain, such as the hallucinations of seeing things, and the shadowy things, the presence I always feel that someone is watching me. Weird noises, pictures falling, and one door in particular keeps opening. I've always made that out to be natural, but I don't know if I can anymore. Especially because now my dog will stand by my side and stand stiff barking and growling in a certain direction. And this has happened countless times, and sometimes my security lights would flash on their own and go on and off without there being anyone around, as I live in quite a rural place. I've always made up the excuse that it would be an animal, like a cat, but I always check, and I never see anything. I'm currently 15. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I had what me and my sister both believed to be a ghost sighting or experience. Now, it wasn't absolutely terrifying, it was more confusing. Me, my sister and my mum lived down a pretty secluded road. Our house was surrounded by trees, and if you passed our house and kept going, within 5 minutes you'd reach our family graveyard. I actually loved living near the graveyard. If I felt lonely, I'd go sit on my great-grandpa's tombstone and just talk about stuff that happened recently. It made me feel like I wasn't alone. So the graveyard was a calming place for me. For my sister, it was nightmarish. She always hated going there, and it's understandable. It's a graveyard, not a home. One day, my mum insisted my sister and I go outside to play. We didn't want to. After a few minutes, we agreed to walk to the graveyard, only because there was a beautiful river down a trail behind it. As we were walking, we kept hearing twigs snap and what sounded like a few coughs. We stopped for a moment before facing the huge hill you had to go up to reach the graveyard. We looked around, then up the hill, and saw no sign of anyone. We brushed it off and started walking up the hill. About halfway up, we heard a very clear cough from directly in front of us. We looked up the hill, and about 6 or 7 feet in front of us was a man. Don't know how tall, but he looked quite pale. Never blinked, never moved, just stared at us. The second my sister saw him, she fell backwards and screamed while running back to the house, leaving me alone as I just continued to stare at him. He was wearing a suit, a brown suit, a black, slightly beaten-up briefcase in his right hand, an old-style watch in his left wrist, round glasses, a black fedora, and black business shoes. He looked familiar, but I couldn't tell where I had seen him from, so I said, "Hi, you look familiar." His face contorted for a moment before a small smile rested on his face. In due time, he said lightly. I heard my mother screaming as I heard her rapid footsteps. I looked down the hill to see her looking around frantically before she saw me and relaxed. I turned back and the man was gone. "Bye," I mumbled before following my mum home. About a month later, me and my sister went to visit our great-grandma, as she was our favourite family member. She was always cooking and making sure you were happy. While I was sitting in the living room, I looked around at the pictures. My heart stopped. I saw a picture of the man, in the same outfit with an arm around my great-grandma's shoulders. They both seemed to be laughing. "Nanny, who is that?" I asked my great-grandma. She smiled and said, "That, my dear, is your great-uncle, my brother. He passed away in a car wreck a year or so ago." I couldn't believe my ears. I immediately told my great-grandma the story, and she smiled. "In due time, indeed." She then hugged me and said, "Be joyful, he let you see him." My family has a weird quirk where when we see we're kids and a family member who passed away was quite connected to us, we see them sometimes. We can talk to them, and they sometimes talk back. That's why I still visit the graveyard. My great-grandpa lets me see him because he died when I was 2. But I was, as he put it, the reason he smiled every day. I'd lived in this house since I was born, and that's my problem. This house, more exactly, the things that live here with us. I have memories of strange things happening here since I was a little kid. The typical haunted house stuff, I guess. Back then, I used to live with fear. Everyone in my family knew something was wrong, but they pretended nothing happened, not to scare me. Time passed, and while I grew up, my family knew they couldn't hide anymore. That's how at age 14, I learned that the former owner of the property, Monica J., committed suicide in an apartment 4 blocks from my house. My parents explained me that although the police called it a suicide, a lot of mysteries were left unsolved in the case. Maybe that's why the house was haunted. I believe that too. My parents are strong Catholics, so one day they called a priest to bless the house. They even arranged a mass for Monica's soul. After that, that was it for them. Nobody should talk about the haunting again. The problem is, what my parents did didn't help a bit. Mainly because the entities living in my house are different than usual. There's a cliche about ghosts. People think ghosts hide and only appear sometimes. People think ghosts play some sort of peekaboo game with you. And how wrong they are. In my house, you can feel how your vision gets blurry when one of these things passes in front of you. And in the night, you can see them as shadows crawling in the darkness. In all the years I've lived here, I've seen a woman, a kid in a tuxedo. In my house, we have a Virgin Mary statue like 4 feet tall in an inner courtyard well. I saw her cry. My soul almost left my body the night I thought how well the eyes in the statue were made, how realistic the teeth were carved, and then touching it just to realise she was actually crying. After all these years, me and my family got used to it. Everyone knows something's wrong, but these things don't bother us that much, and we've learned to live with them. Because all I've experienced nowadays, nothing scares me. Except for one specific entity, and he's the real reason for this post. That thing terrifies me in a way you can't imagine. After having 2 episodes involving that thing, I conclude that no human has felt fear in its life as I've experienced. He stalks my older sister mainly. It all began like 7 years ago. My sister, Mary V, told us how something tall, shadow-like, watched her sleep. She was used to waking up in the middle of the night with an unsettling feeling just to see that thing watching her. She was so scared that she always slept with our dog, a boxer called Bianca. That dog was always alert and she reacted to the slightest move. But my sister told us how that thing would make Bianca sleep like a log. Even if she poked the dog really hard, she wouldn't wake up. Things got worse, and she woke up with bruises and with horrible feelings. She was desperate for help, and my parents called the priest again. He told my sister that maybe what was bothering her was inhuman, a demon. He gave us holy water and an exorcist salt to put on my sister's bedroom. Also, he suggested some saint statues on my sister's room. Years have passed, and that thing broke the statues and ignored everything. He's still there. The priest came again to tell us my sister was experiencing an infestation, and only faith would help us. I'm not a Catholic person, and I don't think that'll help. I'm writing this because recently I've been attacked again. I've only experienced what that thing can do once before, and I don't want to feel it anymore. I'll try my best to describe what it's like. The first time I felt him was when I was 16 or so. I was home alone reading Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows in my room, and out of nowhere I started to feel bad. An unsettling feeling hit me like a truck, as if something really bad was about to happen. It was 4 p.m, so the light entered through my window. It was a cloudy day. I stopped reading. I couldn't ignore that feeling anymore. Then I just started to feel really bad physically. My body started to hurt in a strange way. It was something like that kind of pain you feel in your body the day after you went to the gym. My whole body felt numb. And I saw it. A dark figure moving through the air, coming closer to me. He stopped a few inches away from me, and he was huge. So big, he was preventing the light from entering. My whole room became darker. I started to sweat and shiver. I didn't know what to do, and suddenly he talked to me. Don't get me wrong, not like a voice, but inside my head. As if he could enter in my mind. He just insulted me with the worst things you can imagine. He told me horrible things, and I just covered my ears and begged him to leave. After 1 minute, he just left me alone. As soon as he disappeared, I felt horrible. I couldn't breathe. I was covered in sweat. That numbness in my body was still there, but the worst thing was that I felt invaded and used. I felt hopeless. My despair was so strong, I started crying helplessly. An hour or so passed, and my mother arrived. I told her everything, and I even begged her to get me checked at the doctor, because I really thought I had schizophrenia or something. The results came, and luckily I was fine. But that meant that what I experienced was real too. I've encountered that thing recently once more, and believe me, I don't want that thing living here with us no more. This is my desperate cry for help. No priest helped us. Does anybody know how to get rid of that? Someone experienced something like this? Help! For context, I live in a townhouse surrounded by other townhouses from all 4 sides. All townhouses are almost exactly the same. None of us have backyards, just a garage and a tiny front yard. I'll get straight to the point. Basically what happened is I woke up today at about 1 a.m. because I was hearing some very faint synth music. I'm not sure if I even call it music. It was sort of melodic, but not exactly music. At first I thought it was just part of my dream, and I woke up because I had to pee. After I woke up, I stayed in a bed for a couple of minutes and the sounds didn't go away. So I thought maybe the neighbours are playing music. But first of all, the music had to be super loud for me to hear with closed windows, and I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from exactly. Like it was coming from all the way around. From the wall, floor, middle of the room. I thought maybe I'm just half asleep and imagining it, so I went to the washroom that's just around the corner from my room. When I exited the room, I realised that the sounds are still there in the hallway, and it sounds exactly the same. So it can't be just neighbours playing the music. Since the hallway has no windows, and it would sound more faint than in my room. But judging by how faint it was to begin with, I shouldn't have heard it in the hallway. But it sounded exactly the same, like it was coming from all the ways around me. And the same thing in the bathroom that had no windows. I came back to my room and thought that maybe I'm going crazy. But then my mom came into my room and asked if I could hear the music. I can't explain how happy this made me, because I'm not crazy. So she thought it might be the wind, but it sounded way too artificial, like straight up synth and way too melodic. It doesn't repeat the melody, at least I don't think it did. My mum also said it makes her think of souls flying away. We talked for a couple of minutes, then she went to bed. The sounds kept me awake for another hour. However, I was way too sleepy and tired to even look at the phone. I'd fall asleep and then the sounds would wake me up again. Sometimes it's just one note and nothing for a couple of minutes. Sometimes it's multiple notes, one after the other, but never together. In the morning it was gone. I asked my mum if she remembers it. She said yes. We didn't have time to discuss it because I was late to work, so I'm not sure what she thinks of it. I talked to my boyfriend and explained everything. He said it just sounds very scary and he has no idea what it could be. Thinking about it makes me feel crazy. Like it's so simple and yet I have absolutely no idea what it could be. I don't know if this was necessarily paranormal or sleep paralysis or whatever, but I feel like I have to share in case anyone knows if there's a deeper meaning. This happened last night. Firstly, I couldn't sleep. I was laying wide awake scrolling on TikTok when a tarot reading came up and I resonated a lot with me, so I began watching a longer version of it. After a while, I suddenly felt extremely uneasy, so I decided to try and sleep. The second the clock hit 3 a.m, a lightning of terror shot throughout my body, from head to toe. It felt like something entered my body, and as soon as that thing had travelled from my feet, my whole room creaked. It then sounded like small knocks, almost like footsteps in my room. As a way of trying to calm myself down, I once again used my phone and put on some ASMR. After some time passed, the temperature in the room noticeably dropped. I went from sweating to freezing. I then tried to sleep again. I was laying on my stomach and my thoughts wandered away and the name Adam was spoken over and over. And then suddenly it just said Eve. And once that name entered my mind, it felt like someone was pushing my head down towards my pillow and my body towards the mattress. I felt a pulsating feeling at the back of my head, and in the pulses, I heard banging of metal being hit on metal over and over, and a voice in my head said, Eve, Eve, Eve. And this, my name is healing. I then tried to open my eyes and I couldn't move, and I knew it could be sleep paralysis, so I tried to wiggle my toes and fingers to snap out of it. But when I did and started trying to sit up, I was almost jolted back into that state of hearing banging and someone pushing me down. Eventually, I got out of it and couldn't really sleep anymore because I was so terrified. The way I was pushed down felt almost like a magnet pulling me to the ground. I don't know what happened. It was probably nothing. It's just that a few days ago, I dreamt that I was being chased by a demon, and not gonna lie, I'm not excited to sleep tonight. So I'll start by saying my fiance and I have been watching a ton of paranormal videos on YouTube. My son said he heard tapping on his window on Christmas Eve night. I thought nothing of it because I assumed it was my fiance. My fiance said it wasn't him. My son is 5, so it's possible he was just making it up, but my fiance had an experience last night. He woke me up. I fell asleep on the couch next to him as he was working late. He said he heard what he thought was the screen door closing, then looked over and actually saw it move. He walked outside and nothing was there. He then noticed shortly after that he had 2 scratches on his chest. I was extremely freaked out, considering all the stuff we've been watching lately. We just moved into this house about 3 months ago. Nothing has happened before, except for the door leading to the garage opening randomly when it's been locked. Again, I didn't think anything of that until now. The anniversary of my cat's death just passed. He died a year ago. We were in a different place when he died, but his ashes sit on a counter in our living room. My fiance recently moved the ashes under the Christmas tree. My thinking is if it was our cat, it wouldn't have scratched him. Only evil spirits cause harm, right?
silly story about our missing TV remote. Our only TV is in the living room, and I'm often the last to watch it. My usual routine would be to turn it off, place the remote on our coffee table, turn off the lights and head to bed. The next day, significant other comes home and we get ready to eat a meal in front of the TV, as per usual. But when it came to using the remote, it was missing. We finished our meals and spent the next half hour looking everywhere for it. We checked all around the couch, under it, pulled the pillows and blankets off, moved the cushions, literally checked the cracks and crevices with a flashlight. We then checked the tables, kitchen, bedroom, and even bathroom. We have a tiny apartment and it's usually very tidy, so its disappearance was super strange. Ended up finally getting a new remote and syncing that to the TV. We didn't bother putting the couch back together. Here, I would like to mention that we have our sides of the couch, and that one blanket is draped tightly and tucked into the back. So imagine my surprise the following day when I found the missing remote sitting neatly on the back of my significant other's side of the couch, where it would have been under the blanket. We were super confused because we took the couch apart. It was the one place we checked thoroughly, and yet it was just sitting there. As a student in the late 90s, I was asked to take part in the last UK university's pistol shooting competition at Bisley Camp, home of Britain's largest competitive shooting complex. I wasn't keen on it, as the Dunblane massacre had put a grim slant on things, and pistols were about to be permanently banned. With peer pressure, I agreed to go along. A minibus would take the team up. We'd have the competition, come home, go to the pub for a laugh. The night before the competition, I had a crystal clear dream of a white Ford Capri and a horrible accident. A row of 4 orange-leaf trees, a broken axle, a Scottish woman with a small black dog asking if I was alright. I woke up that morning to be told our minibus booking had fallen through and some guy called Luke would drive the 4 of us. I didn't know the guy, had never met him, never heard of him, knew nothing about him or his car, and had never been to Bisley. Luke was just a friend of a team member doing us a favour, yet he was wearing the red jacket, black jeans, and blue baseball cap of the person I'd seen in my dream. When he turned up at our halls of residence in a white 2-door Ford Capri, both I and the friend I'd told about the dream essentially went pale and refused to get in the car. Guys, you're being ridiculous. I had it serviced last month. It's old, but it's fine. Nah, man. The front axle of the car, it's... What? The axle is fine. Pissed off because we were late, he gets in and throws the car up and down the driveway, jamming on the brakes and then shouts, "See? Get in, we're late." The day goes fine. Competition ends, all in high spirits. Get in the car, and idiot Luke decides to speed up the main road out of the camp. Just as I yell, "Stop the fucking car, I'm getting out!" there's an almighty pop, followed by screeching, as the car veers left into a row of 4 orange-leaf trees and comes to a halt. Lots of panicked shouting and cursing. We get out and, yep, the axle has snapped. A crowd gathers due to the noise. As I'm standing there freaked out by it all, a small woman I somehow recognise walks up and, yep, asks me if I'm alright. She has a Scottish accent and is walking a small black terrier. When the AA man turns up, he tells us that if this happened at speed on the motorway, there's a good chance we'd all be dead. We eventually got home via some ridiculous series of buses, and I sat eating in silence in the dining hall with my friend, both of us too fucked up to say anything. I described the whole thing to him that morning, and for several weeks afterward, he became quite distant, as though he mentally connected me with death itself. About a decade later, we caught up and the event came up in conversation. He found it much harder to talk about, but his comment has always struck me. He said that what I told him and what occurred that morning had forced him to see life in very different terms. Essentially, he had to face up to the possibility that there was more to this life than he was willing to consider, and that it frightened him. He'd even had a few nightmares about it over the ensuing years. As he said, the sheer size of it all and what it meant has always scarred me since then. I'm in my 40s now, and I find myself thinking about it every so often. I still find it very hard to describe what I truly feel. I just know that this life and this death are far larger than we can ever comprehend. To finish it all, a couple of years ago, I had to sit in the back seat of my brother's two-door car on a quick journey. For the first time in my life, I had what I now know is a panic attack, and clearly linked to what I just described. It was horrific, and I'll never sit in one of those ever again. Even thinking about it makes me slightly nauseous. This stuff is buried deep in our consciousness. Trust your dreams. My mum passed away in 2010. My younger sister was put as executor for everything having to do with our mother. She was to take her dog named Gizzy, really a mutt, wiry hair, no structure, would not even go outside and pee. When we brought her home, my third son took her, said he would clean up after her, feed her, walk her, you know all the things a kid will say but never do. My wife and I did buy a cage because she would not pee or poop where she slept. We set her up with water and food inside the cage, and it wasn't a box, it was literally a cage. Wire mesh. Put her up at night out in the morning, walk around, go outside with the other pups and eat and drink. Then when we left or when we went to bed, it went back to the cage. It had a doggy bed and some towels, kind of cushy comfort. This lasted for about 3 months, and my son was getting really attached to the pup. So I told my little sis that if she wanted Gizzy, then she'd better take him now. Because I was done with the back and forth. Yes, I will take her. No, I don't want to. You know how it is. At the 3-month mark, I told my son that she was his, permanently, not going to his aunt's. It's done. She's ours. He was elated, and I was happy to see him happy. And the poor thing needed a home. Win-win. Well, almost. I was working 3 on 4 off, and 4 on 3 off, 12-hour shifts. So I was up at odd times, and my wife would fall asleep in the living room sometimes, way before I was ready to go to bed. And I would shut down the house, then get her to go to bed when I was ready. One night, I had shut down everything except the receiver. We have a 5.1 Dolby, that the old receiver had died long ago. So we were using a little Panasonic that we had gotten at Fry's. Well, everything was shut down except that receiver and a light, when over the speakers, I heard really fast, "Thank you for," and then slower, "taking care of," and very clearly, "Gizzy for me." I was just dumbfounded. What the hell just happened? I tried to recreate it, went and checked the receiver, and it wouldn't come on. I tried unplugging it, checked the fuse, reconnecting the wires. Nothing from that day forward, the speaker would not work. But its last message sent chills up and down my spine. And this is one of the reasons I know there's life after death. When I was a kid, for a long time, my family and I lived in an apartment building in Chicago. In this building, we experienced many paranormal things that feel evil. One of the experiences I had, I wanted to share with you all. To get this apartment building, you had to enter through a gate. After entering the gate, you would just follow the cemented path, which would probably take 5 seconds to get to some stairs. Going up the stairs, you would see windows to the first floor apartment straight ahead. Looking to the right, there would be a door that would allow you to enter the apartment complex. Now entering through this door would take you to an extremely small room with 2 doors. The door to the left would take you into the first floor apartment. The door to the right would take you to the apartment I lived in, the second floor. As you enter through the door to the right, it would lead to almost spiral stairs. After reaching the top of the stairs, you would yet again reach another door, which would actually take you fully inside the second floor apartment. Opening that door, you would immediately see the living room. One afternoon, I was home alone watching anime in the living room. I was maybe 15 when this happened. I remember hearing someone opening up the first door to get into the building, and the second door to get into the second apartment. I began to hear someone walk up the stairs. At this time of day, I was under the impression either my mom was done with work or my brother was done with wrestling practice, getting home, which I was excited not to be home by myself. As the footsteps got closer to the door, I glanced at the bottom of the door, which I then saw a shadow. Usually at this time, I would hear keys as someone would be preparing to unlock the door. In this incident, I didn't. I just saw a shadow under the door. I started to hear a slow scratch, starting from the top of the door to the bottom. I honestly thought my brother was being an idiot playing a prank on me, so I let it be and continued watching TV. As I was watching TV, I noticed the scratching continued on the door, getting more and more intense, and the shadow of someone was still present under the door. At this point I was annoyed, because I was like, dude, I'm trying to watch TV. Quit trying to play games with me. So I got up from the couch and went to the door and slammed it open. As I slammed it open, I looked around and didn't see my mom nor my brother. So I then thought, this idiot is behind the door. So I checked behind the door. My brother wasn't there. I did see scratch marks on my door though. My heart started racing and I ran down the stairs and ran out of my apartment. Called my brother up and he was still at wrestling practice. This happened to me a few years ago, and I've always wondered how the hell it happened. Since it was something so physical, it's hard to wrap my mind around it. I was in college, home for the summer, and about to go back to school. My boyfriend of about 2 years had gotten me a ring the previous year in November for our anniversary, so I had it for almost a year. I had specifically picked out the ring from Pandora, and it was a limited timepiece. I'd never seen it before. I'd asked him for it. It was a simple red heart and the band was scalloped, if that makes sense. It was nothing crazy, and I wore it basically every day. I kept track of it very well. While I was packing to go back to school, I packed up all my jewellery and had accidentally packed away my daily jewellery that day. I figured no biggie, because I'll be moving things in the next day, getting sweaty and whatnot, so I didn't want to lose anything or ruin anything anyways. And I'd unpack it the next day. 2 of my friends had driven from different states the day before so that we could move into our college house together, and came to stay the night at my dad's since I was in the same state as our college. We hung out in my room, watched TV, then went to bed because the next day was going to be long. I woke up the next morning and immediately noticed a ring to the right of my bed, on the ledge of my wall. The ledge was only about 1.5 inches thick. You couldn't fit much on it. I picked it up and it was the exact same ring my boyfriend had bought me, but the heart in the middle was clear instead of red. I thought it was so weird. I picked up the ring and brought it into the room with my 2 friends and asked if either of them had left their ring in my room last night, and that it was so funny we had the same one. They said it wasn't theirs. I laughed and told them to stop messing with me, and they looked really confused. They both said they had never seen the ring before and never owned one like it. I really thought they were trying to screw with me, but they genuinely denied it and were just as confused as I was. Then I texted my boyfriend, asking if maybe he had bought 2 different ones to test out the colours, and forgot about it, and it somehow ended up in my room. He said he definitely only bought one, and it was the red one. I reached out to my dad's girlfriend, who was the only other woman that stayed in that house, if she owned the ring, and she said she had never seen it before. I was trying to check any logical explanation there was. I know what you're probably thinking, that I didn't actually pack the ring from my boyfriend, and it was up there all along. I ran to my packed bag and pulled out the ring my boyfriend gave me, still as red as I remember. I was holding the two identical rings in my hand, with no explanation as to how the second one came about. The second ring was also my size. I went to Pandora's website to look at the ring, and it wasn't even sold anymore. I couldn't find it anywhere. I still have no idea where it came from or why. The creepiest piece is that my dad's house was built in the 1700s. It was the original farmhouse of the town he lives in. Definitely not short on paranormal possibilities. To this day, I'm dying to know how it happened. Would love to know people's opinions on this. It was a hot summer night, and I couldn't sleep due to the oppressive heat. As I tossed and turned in my bed, I suddenly heard a faint knock coming from the ceiling above me. Thinking it was just the old pipes in the house making noise, I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. Eventually, I couldn't take it any longer and decided to investigate. I slowly made my way to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs, I was greeted by a ghostly figure hovering in the corner of the room. It had a translucent, ethereal quality to it, and its eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The spirit seemed to be trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. Suddenly, it vanished before my eyes, leaving me alone in the dark attic. I fled back to my bedroom, my mind racing with questions. Who was this spirit, and why was it trying to communicate with me? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had a message it needed to impart, but I may never know what it was. That night, I learned that the paranormal was real, and that there are forces beyond our understanding at work in the world. The spirit in the attic will stay with me forever, a reminder that there is so much more to the universe than we can see or comprehend. I moved about 8 hours away from my family years ago. We go home several times a year. That time is usually split between my family and my husband. I have an enormous family, so I don't always get to see everyone when I'm there. My 2-year-old son has met my grandpa 2 or 3 times. My grandpa had early dementia. At family functions, he would sit but not really engage. He would smile and nod when you spoke to him, but that was it for those last few years. When he was healthy, he had a giant personality, absolutely adored kids, had a big booming voice, a big storyteller, and he was everyone's grandpa. My son had only ever heard me refer to him as my grandpa when talking to my husband, family or friends. I called my grandpa Papa though. My son never heard me say that. A week before he passed, I gave birth to my second son. Knowing how much he loved kids, I FaceTimed him in the hospital and told him he had a new great-grandson. He nodded and cried tears of happiness. All this time, his dementia was so bad, he could no longer speak. My 2-year-old kept telling us there was a ghost and would point and say there was a man following Mum with the baby. It was unsettling because I have had experiences my entire life. I would just be super casual and ask my son if he was scared or if the man was mean, and he would say no. One night, I was putting my son to bed and I prayed every night. And when I got to the part where I asked God to surround his bed with angels to keep the evil away, my son stopped me, got a big smile and said, "Papa comes to protect me." I was in total shock. I pulled up a photo of him and my son pointed and said, "Yes, the man is Papa." I asked him how he knew his name, and he told me that Papa told him. I have tons of stories that happened to my family and I in this house. My dad bought a piece of property that had belonged to an old plantation. My neighbours lived in the plantation house across the lane. My dad built a massive, beautiful home on our lot. We had 2 giant trees in the front yard, and we were told a teacher got hung for teaching the slave children how to read and write. Things immediately started happening to me. The rest of my family made jokes about it and tried to make me feel crazy. After about 3 weeks, I noticed my parents and brother started getting quiet when I would bring stuff up. They finally admitted to things happening to them. The house had a basement that was also enormous. Most of the basement was finished, and the unfinished parts were behind doors leading out of the unfinished living room. There was a finished office. In the office, there was a small door hallway up the wall that led to a crawl space that was under the laundry room. My dad had asked my brother to get in there and spread gravel out in the back corner. We had lived there for several years. My brother and I were both in high school. My brother randomly comes running into my room, which is 3 stories away from the crawl space. He was extremely mad and asking me if I was pranking him. Shocked, I said no and asked him what was happening. He told me every time he got to the far back corner, he would hear a woman giggle from the office. She would stick a hand in and hit the switch for the lights. Still giggling, she would close the door on the space, leaving him in pitch darkness, where he would have to army crawl across dirt and gravel and hit the door to get out. He said it happened 3 or 4 times. When he saw my reaction, he knew it couldn't be me. I decided to walk down with him and sit at the door with a flashlight and guard the door and light switch while he finished spreading out the gravel. Right around the time I got pregnant a year ago, one of my friends passed away in a tragic accident. She was a friend from college and had recently moved within an hour of my home. The week before she passed, we had made plans for her to come visit the following weekend. I had this crazy vivid dream that I was going to a city to visit her. In my dream, not just anyone could get to the city. You had to have a guide to get there. I was in a weird-looking car and my guide was unnaturally tall. Silver shiny hair, no wrinkles at all. Appeared young. He didn't talk to me at all, just drove. We drove through tidal waves that hid the road. Once we were in the city, he dropped me off. The city was magical, but I was surprised to see it look like any other city. I met my friend at a restaurant and we talked like old times. She kept telling me how happy she was. Her death really upset me, not just because I was going to miss her, but she had finally found a good guy and she was in a solid relationship with, and I knew she wanted to get married and have kids. She also had recently landed a dream job right before her death. During the dream, we continued to eat our dinner talking. She started telling me I was going to be so in love with my child and that we would grow to be best friends as my child aged. When she was telling me this, I could see her running and playing in a field with a kid, but I couldn't tell the gender. My husband and I were going to wait until our child's birth to find out. In my dream, I asked her, "You know my child?" She smiled and said yes, and that they play all the time. I asked what the gender was and she laughed and said, "I know your husband wants to be surprised, and I refused to ruin it." After dinner, we walked down the street, and there were stores everywhere and people everywhere. The vibe was very jolly, almost like any other city during Christmas time. I looked at her and said, "Why don't you come back with me?" She smiled and said, "You know I can't do that." "I promise I'm very happy here." I got sad and said, "Well, why don't I shop with you here for a little while?" She laughed and said, "You also know you can't stay here." We gave each other a hug and I climbed back into the weird car with my guide. The dream was so vivid and so real. I'm certain it was her giving me some peace, that she really truly is okay with not living out her goals here on Earth. So when my younger brother was around 4 years old, he was very into normal young boy stuff. Trucks, swords, monsters, etc. But he had no knowledge of anything truly violent like war. There was no way for him to know. But one night when my mom was talking to him before bed, He randomly told her that he remembered jumping out of a plane. He said that he was the last one to jump and that he had stuff strapped to his chest. He went on to describe in perfect detail a World War II US military uniform, and that him and other men had to jump to save something. He described it right down to the appearance of the plane, the colour, even the style the boots he wore. He didn't say much else, and went to sleep. Like I mentioned before, he had no possible way of even knowing what a war was, let alone the soldiers' uniforms. We didn't have phones or internet access until we were much older, and then surely don't teach that stuff at the ABCs in preschool. It freaked my mum out pretty bad, and it's kind of crazy looking back. He says he doesn't remember it at all.
Okay, so I've talked to many people about this, and many people have had similar experiences. When they were a child, they felt like this world was more like a playground. My first memory regarding this was 8, when I was with my friend who was also 8, and we were returning from school, while talking about random kid stuff in front of my home, when we started talking about something bizarre. We started imagining that the world was like a game, like we didn't belong here actually, and that we're just characters inside of that game, being controlled by some kind of an alien race. This thing has always stuck with me for some reason. I've had other thoughts about that world. Not just thoughts, but very vivid daydreams about a world that's falling apart. And that same alien species, in order to extend their time, they would just use their technology to recreate their existence in other universes, simulating them pretty much. And these thoughts were quite before Soma and games of that scope. PS1 era of gaming back then. Now also one of the stories from that same friend, he spoke about encountering weird anomalies when approaching TVs when he was little. Pretty much at age 8 to 10, he would sometimes feel the pulse of the TV, and once it hit him so hard that he fell over and was dazed and confused. I don't know. Like once, I remember he said that he could feel the surge of electricity. Another friend, when she was little, imagined that she wasn't inside of her body, and that everyone around her and her were the tall people, and not really people. Also, I know kids have a strong imagination, but not that well-defined sense of death, and the concept of something abstract like death. Some would say what I felt was because my brain was scared of death, so it made up these crazy stories. But I was an 8-year-old back then. I didn't think about dying. It's weird. And also, when you look at the quantum level of the universe, things start getting really freaky. So freaky that during my quantum physics classes in uni, the professor would talk about how many quantum physicists would have formed a cult around it if there were no other physicists that are in different fields to wake them up from that idea. I mean, there are particles that appear and disappear, change states and go through matter. Go through us, but never interact with matter including us. I always imagined said particles to be the way that the Matrix scans everything this way, using these very small and weird particles. Weird world.
Christmas Eve, we were running out of time to do all the fun things we wanted to do with the kids before bedtime. I have 3 under 4 years old. One of the things was to sprinkle magic reindeer food on the front lawn. We planned to do this earlier, but we ended up going out front at 6:45, so it was already dark out. As the kids were sprinkling the food around and having a blast, I looked across the street between 2 of my neighbours' houses, and I saw someone in the shadows. This was a particularly dark area of the street, and this figure was wearing all black and blending in very well. I couldn't take my eyes off this figure in case they made a move towards my kids. It was below freezing out. The person didn't have a phone out they were looking at. They weren't out smoking. They weren't going for a walk. They just stood in the shadows watching my family from about 150 feet away. At one point, I think they noticed I was watching and moved further back into the shadows. We were there for 10 minutes and this figure never moved to go inside a house or walk down the block. On another night, I may have gone to talk to the person, but not on Christmas Eve, when we still had 100 other things to do. I did call the PD when I got in because it was so odd and reminded me of Richard Ramirez. They came an hour later and, of course, saw no one. Here's my best description of what I saw. Remember, it was night. This person was about 150 feet away in the shadows. 5'7", slim, dressed all in black, but I couldn't tell what kind of clothes. Maybe black hoodie and matching pants. I didn't see any shoes. The face was the weirdest part, because I couldn't make out any features, just a sort of pale oval. The best way I can describe it was Slender Man, but shorter and a little thicker. After the kids were done, I passed the baby in my arms to my wife so they could go in first, and I could watch to make sure this person didn't try and follow us. I told her to go first because of a creeper, and she looked in the direction, but didn't see anything. I've had some strange experiences growing up in the northwestern part of Montana. I'd like to share my first one. We were living in Somers near Flathead Lake. I was around 5 years old. I lived with my mom, dad, and newborn brother. Our house was a one-story rancher that was pretty secluded. My mom worked nights at a casino and sometimes would sleep on one of the couches in the living room when she got home. I wanted to sleep by her, so I tried to sleep on the other couch, facing the dining room and kitchen area. The oven light was on, casting a soft yellow light. I was laying on my side, looking towards the kitchen. I woke up, and what I saw was a disembodied shadow in the shape of a human arm sticking out of the wall. It extended from the side, as if sandwiched behind the fridge in the kitchen, and the wall separating the living room. It had a slight bend at the elbow, its palm facing up towards the ceiling. I noticed it was holding something in its hand. It looked like it was holding a brain. I remember the pink and grey colours. It was shaped like seeing the human brain from the side. I was more disturbed by this observation, even more than the shadow limb itself. The light from the kitchen is behind the arm, making it very prominent and out of place. I laid there looking at this thing for a while. It never moved. I don't remember being very scared, but definitely confused and unsettled. I don't think I was dreaming or experiencing sleep paralysis, as I was able to lean up to try and get a closer look. I eventually fell back asleep. This memory is so vivid to me. My grandma recently passed, and I wanted to share a story she used to tell. Now, some of the supernatural or paranormal stories weren't really that scary, or more mythical, like the stories both her and my dad would tell of little people called minnipeds, or little people. The name might be a rough spelling, as it was in Kiowa-Tanoan, and I don't know the spellings of it, but that's how it sounded in English. But there was one story she'd always tell when we drove around the old road around Mount Scott and Lake Latonka, near Medicine Park in Oklahoma. In the late 1960s, before having my dad, but had my uncle for about 5 years, she lived close to the tribe in Carnegie, but still lived close to the Medicine Park. Usually she would go to Carnegie during the week for groceries, as she worked nights at her job during the weekend. But on the odd occasion, she'd go to the Medicine Park to get whatever groceries we needed that weekend she either forgot or didn't get enough of. The reason she did is because there were no stores in Carnegie that were open late in the night, but there was one in the Medicine Park. She then told us that the mountain we drove around was sacred to the tribe, and would promise that no road would be built there by the government in the 1900s. But of course, they built some there anyway. So when driving, you can get a good view of the mountain and the lake closer. Because of this, it's now haunted by a spirit that's aggressive if you drive at night. Now, a lot can agree that native creatures and supernatural stories were just made up, but this was the first real event that made her believe more than what she thought was real. regarding native ghost stories. This particular night, the clouds covered the moon and stars, so it was darker than usual. It didn't bother her much, as she can still see the road, and I'll be damned if I'm wasting gas to Carnegie. But around halfway through the trip, her car stopped, just turned off by itself. She thought it was weird, but probably just something wrong with her car. She went to turn it on, and nothing. So she tried a second time. Immediately after attempting to start it a second time, she said she heard something whoosh above the car. Then she stated it a third time and it worked. But in the span of about 4 seconds, she said she saw a large black figure in the middle of the road, not 6 feet away from the car. When she noticed, she said it reacted to the lights, shining as quickly as it turned its head and showed its big glowing eyes. It then flew up into the air, never to be seen again. She just called it the owl, but me and my brother liked the name Owl Man better. Kind of a joke, as we're obsessed with the silly cryptids like Frogman. But the reason she claims this was a significant encounter was because owls in our tribe are taboo and are said to be bad omens. If you see one, it means someone close to you is going to die very soon. And about a year after, when my dad was less than a year old, I found out my grandpa had cancer. It would be a little over a decade before he died from it, but the owl and the bad news were not coincidental. Before my father left Oklahoma, he'd lived with his mom and father and occasionally with his other family in Carnegie. It was either the family in the town or outside in the woods. Very few times he'd be with his family outside the town and would usually refuse to want to go. It was a couple of cabin houses and it sucked having to stay there, he told me. But being so young, he'd usually have to stay. His great aunt and cousins lived there from his mother's side. The great aunt was very old, being 76 at the time. She only got up and was about to cook, clean, and use the restroom and go to bed. Even then, she'd have trouble using a cane to get around. She was also obese, which didn't help with her age and moving around. She'd spend most of her free time sitting down knitting and making quilts. One night, my dad asked her if he could go out into the woods to walk around, but because it was so late, she didn't let him. He asked her why, and she said there were wild animals and spirits in the woods that could hurt him after dark. My dad wasn't too convinced at the time, as he never believed any native legends or supernatural things, so he just figured she didn't want him to get attacked by a wild animal. But his cousins had overheard what was going on, and the older ones, who were her grandkids, said that she was very, very serious about the matter. They shared stories of creepy things happening in the woods after dark, and even during the day. They told him that even if he ever went into the woods alone during the day, to stay alert, because spirits there can cause you to get lost and to go home if you hear silence in the woods. Nature knows when something unnatural and supernatural is around, so all the animals and even the wind in the trees will go silent. They told him that animals in the woods aren't always animals, and are in fact people unable to become human again. After telling him that, they let it slip about the aunt being a shapeshifter. She didn't deny it, and said it was true, but rarely became one because she never needed to anymore. Not convinced, my dad and his cousins asked her to prove it. She agreed and said she'd show them in the morning. Morning came, and of course they again pressured her to show them. She agreed and made everyone leave the cabin. She told them to wait out there for a minute and to go to the other cabin and she'll be there. So they left and stood between the cabins for 1 minute. While they waited, my dad said he saw a rat about as big as an eggplant run across the small field between the cabins. After he saw it go to the cabin, he ran in and saw his aunt sitting in a chair, chuckling and clasping her hands. Her other cousins, who didn't see the rat and also weren't her grandchildren, still didn't believe her and asked if she could do it again. And she did. She told them the same thing, to stand outside for a minute and come to the other cabin. So they did. And when my dad saw the rat, he pointed it out, and everyone saw it go to the other cabin. Heading back to the cabin, she said she'd be in there, in a chair chuckling again. Maybe she was pulling their legs, but he claimed there was absolutely no way she could have gone from one cabin to the other without being seen. You see, the cabins they stayed at were built in a big field surrounded by woods, and the field was flat and open. If anyone or anything went across the field to the other cabin, you would most definitely see it.